He invited her as a punchline, the maid in a ballroom full of millionaires, expected to stumble and prove their prejudices right. But when Ruth Adams stepped through those gold-trimmed doors in emerald silk, every champagne glass froze mid-air, every cruel whisper died on polished lips, and the man who thought he knew her realized he'd never seen her at all. Welcome back, my beautiful family. Before we begin, please click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Ruth Adams had perfected the art of being invisible. At 25, she moved through the sprawling penthouse like a shadow, silent, efficient, unnoticed. Her hands, calloused but careful, dusted the mahogany bookshelves in David Cole's study, each leather-bound legal tome worth more than her monthly salary. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long rectangles across Persian rugs that cost more than a year of her rent. She didn't resent the luxury. She had learned long ago that resentment was a weight she couldn't afford to carry. Ruth! Ruth! Sandra's voice cut through the quiet like a knife through silk. Ruth set down her microfiber cloth and smoothed her plain gray uniform. She'd heard that tone before, sharp, entitled, designed to remind her of her place. Sandra Mitchell, David's girlfriend of 8 months, treated the penthouse like her personal kingdom and Ruth like an inconvenient piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be kicked. Yes, Miss Mitchell. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom, her dark eyes calm, her expression neutral. Sandra stood before a full-length mirror, draped in a crimson designer gown that probably cost more than Ruth's sister's college tuition. Her blonde hair was swept into an elaborate updo, diamonds glittering at her throat, the kind of diamonds that came with insurance policies and armed guards. Does this make me look fat? Sandra turned sideways, examining her reflection with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a stone. Ruth knew the answer Sandra wanted. She always knew. You look beautiful, Miss Mitchell. Of course I do. Sandra's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned fully now, studying Ruth with the kind of predatory interest a cat might show a mouse. You know, Ruth, I've been thinking about you. Ruth's spine stiffened imperceptibly. Nothing good ever followed those words. David and I are attending the Cole and Harrison 10th anniversary gala tomorrow night. 500 guests. Politicians, judges, billionaires. The absolute cream of society. Sandra paused, letting the words hang in the air like expensive perfume. And I thought, wouldn't it be charitable of us to invite you? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. That's very kind, Miss Mitchell, but Oh, I insist. Sandra's smile widened, and Ruth saw the trap closing. David agrees. You work so hard for us. You deserve a night out. Consider it, a reward. The way she said, reward, made it sound like a punishment. Ruth's mind raced. She'd worked in enough wealthy households to recognize cruelty disguised as kindness. This wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. Sandra wanted to parade her in front of high society, to watch her stumble and fumble, to use her as entertainment. Look at David's poor little maid, so out of place among real people. I don't have anything appropriate to wear to such an event, Ruth said quietly, offering an escape route she knew Sandra wouldn't take. Oh, wear whatever you want. Come as you are. Sandra waved a manicured hand dismissively. Everyone will understand. It's not like we expect you to fit in. Just, be yourself. That'll be enough. She turned back to the mirror, dismissing Ruth with her indifference. David will text you the details. 7 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, that would be embarrassing. Ruth nodded and retreated, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. As she returned to the study, she heard Sandra's laughter echoing down the hallway, followed by the murmur of David's voice as he entered the bedroom. More laughter. They were laughing about her. She picked up her cloth and resumed dusting, her movements mechanical, her mind somewhere else entirely. Ruth Adams hadn't always been invisible. There was a time, a lifetime ago, it seemed, when she'd stood in conference rooms with ministers and nonprofit directors, when her presentations on literacy programs had commanded attention, when her fluency in 4 languages had opened doors across 3 continents. She'd coordinated educational initiatives that reached 50,000 children. She'd negotiated with government officials and written grant proposals that secured millions in funding. And then her mother got sick. Stage 4 cancer was expensive in ways that destroyed more than just bodies. It demolished savings accounts, college funds, retirement plans, and futures. Ruth had left her position as a literacy coordinator to care for her mother full-time, watching the strongest woman she'd ever known waste away over 18 brutal months. After her mother died, there was nothing left, no money, no connections, no professional network that remembered her. Just debt and a younger sister, Joy, who needed to finish college. So Ruth cleaned houses. She scrubbed toilets and polished silver and became invisible, because invisibility paid $15 an hour and didn't ask questions about the gap in her resume. But she had never forgotten who she was. That evening, Ruth took the subway to the small apartment she shared with Joy in Brooklyn. The contrast between David's penthouse and their 2-bedroom walk-up was almost comical, from marble and mahogany to linoleum and second-hand furniture. But it was theirs, paid for with honest work, and Ruth loved it more than all of David's luxury combined. Joy was sprawled on their threadbare couch, surrounded by textbooks, her natural hair pulled into a messy bun. At 21, she was everything Ruth had been before life forced different choices, bright-eyed, optimistic, convinced the world was fair if you worked hard enough. How was work? Joy asked without looking up from her sociology textbook. Interesting. Ruth set down her bag and began preparing dinner, chicken, rice, vegetables, the simple meal they rotated through their weekly budget. I've been invited to a gala. That got Joy's attention. She sat up, eyes wide. A what? David's law firm is celebrating their 10th anniversary. Black tie event. 500 guests. Ruth kept her tone neutral, focusing on chopping carrots. Ruthie, that's amazing. Why don't you sound excited? Ruth set down her knife and turned to face her sister. Because I wasn't invited to be honored, Joy. I was invited to be mocked. Understanding dawned slowly across Joy's face. Oh. Sandra thinks it'll be funny. The poor maid at a billionaire's party. She probably has a betting pool on how long before I use the wrong fork or call someone by the wrong title. Joy's jaw tightened with anger. Then don't go. You don't owe them anything. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, something shifting in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. Not anger. Not even indignation. Something closer to resolve. Actually, she said slowly, I think I will go. What? Why? Ruth smiled, and it was a smile Joy hadn't seen on her sister's face in 3 years, sharp, knowing, alive. Because Sandra Mitchell has no idea who she's dealing with. None of them do. They see a maid. They think they see my worth. She returned to chopping vegetables, her movements precise. Maybe it's time to remind people, and myself, that I'm still Ruth Adams. And Ruth Adams has never been invisible. She's just been quiet. Joy stared at her sister with a mixture of awe and concern. What are you planning? Nothing dramatic. I'm just going to show up. Ruth's smile widened. Sometimes that's enough. That night, after Joy fell asleep, Ruth sat at their small kitchen table with her laptop, a 5-year-old model that wheezed when it powered up but still worked. She opened her email and scrolled through old contacts, names and addresses from her previous life. Most were probably outdated. Most people had probably forgotten her. But not all of them. She composed a careful email to Pierre Okafor, the Nigerian billionaire philanthropist she'd worked with on a literacy initiative in 2019. They'd spent weeks together planning community centers across West Africa. He'd called her brilliant. He'd said she had a gift for seeing people's potential. She wondered if he'd remember. Mr. Okafor. I hope this message finds you well. You may not remember me, Ruth Adams, Literacy Coordinator for the Pan-African Education Initiative in 2019. I'm reaching out because I find myself in an unexpected situation and wondered if you might be attending the Cole and Harrison 10th Anniversary Gala tomorrow evening in Manhattan. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was this desperate? Manipulative? Was she stooping to Sandra's level by planning a countermove? No. Sandra had invited her to prove poor people were lesser. Ruth was simply accepting the invitation as herself, fully herself, not the diminished version poverty had tried to make her. She finished the email and pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Then Ruth went to her closet and pulled out a garment bag she hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside was an emerald silk gown she'd worn to a UNESCO gala in Paris, back when she'd been Ruth Adams, coordinator and advocate, before she'd become Ruth Adams, maid. She held the dress up to the dim light. It still fit. She knew it would. Tomorrow night, Sandra Mitchell and David Cole and everyone in that ballroom would learn something important. You could take away someone's job, their money, their status, but you couldn't take away who they were. And Ruth Adams had always been extraordinary. She just needed to remind the world. The morning of the gala arrived with the kind of crisp autumn sunshine that made Manhattan look like it belonged in a postcard. Ruth moved through David's penthouse with her usual efficiency, but there was something different in the air, a charge, like the moment before lightning strikes. David emerged from his bedroom at 9, already dressed in casual slacks and a pressed shirt, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. At 42, he was handsome in that effortless way wealthy white men often were, tall, fit, confident from a lifetime of doors opening before he even knocked. "Morning, Ruth," he said, barely glancing at her as he poured coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "Sandra mentioned she invited you to the gala tonight." "Yes, sir." He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. For a moment, Ruth thought she saw something like guilt flicker across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by the practiced smile of a man who'd learned to rationalize his choices. That's good. Should be a nice evening. Just, He paused, searching for words. Just be yourself, okay? Don't feel pressured to, be anything you're not. Don't embarrass us, Ruth translated silently. Stay in your lane. Remember your place. I understand, Mr. Cole. He nodded, relieved to have discharged his duty, and disappeared into his study with his coffee and his morning briefing papers. David Cole was a man who'd built his reputation on defending the underdog, pro bono cases for immigrants, legal aid for the homeless, speeches about justice and equality. He'd won awards. Been featured in magazines. But he'd never once asked Ruth about her life, her dreams, or her story. She was furniture to him. Useful, necessary, but not quite human. Sandra arrived an hour later in a whirlwind of shopping bags and excitement, her heels clicking against the marble floors like a countdown. She was meeting her society friends for brunch before the gala, and the penthouse became her staging ground, makeup spread across the bathroom counter, 3 different dress options laid out on the bed, her phone constantly buzzing with messages. "Ruth," she called. "Come help me decide." Ruth set down the vacuum and entered the bedroom. Sandra stood between 2 gowns, one silver, one gold, both obscenely expensive. "Which one says, I'm important but approachable?" Sandra asked, tilting her head. "The gold," Ruth said quietly. "It's warmer." You're right. See, David? Ruth has an eye for these things." Sandra turned to her boyfriend, who'd appeared in the doorway. "Even she knows quality when she sees it, even if she can't afford it." The casual cruelty was delivered with a smile, as if it were a compliment. David said nothing. Sandra gathered her bags and headed for the door, then paused, turning back to Ruth with exaggerated concern. "You are still coming tonight, aren't you? You didn't change your mind?" "I'll be there, Miss Mitchell." "Wonderful." Sandra's eyes gleamed. "I can't wait to introduce you to everyone. My friends are so curious about you. I've told them all about our little charity case." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 7 o'clock sharp. The grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel. "Don't be late." The door closed behind her, and silence flooded back into the penthouse. Ruth stood motionless for a moment, then returned to her work. She vacuumed. She dusted. She changed the sheets and scrubbed the bathroom and prepared David's lunch. She did everything she was paid to do, her face calm, her movement steady. But inside, something was building, not anger, not revenge, but a quiet, fierce determination. At 3 o'clock, she finished her shift and took the subway home. Joy was already there, having skipped her afternoon classes, and the apartment smelled like hair products and determination. "Okay," Joy announced, pointing Ruth toward a chair she'd set up in front of their bathroom mirror. "We're doing this right. Sit." "Joy, you don't have to." "Sit, Ruthie." For the next 2 hours, Joy worked magic. She washed and deep-conditioned Ruth's natural hair, then styled it into an elegant updo with twisted coils that framed her face like a crown. She did Ruth's makeup, subtle but striking, highlighting the deep brown of her eyes and the sharp beauty of her cheekbones. "You're gorgeous," Joy whispered, stepping back to admire her work. "You've always been gorgeous. I'm so glad you're going to let them see it." Ruth stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her wasn't the invisible maid. She was Ruth Adams, educated, accomplished, powerful. The woman she'd been forced to hide for 3 years. "I checked my email," Ruth said softly. Pierre responded. "He'll be there tonight." Joy's eyes widened. "The billionaire from your nonprofit days. He remembers me. Called me one of the most brilliant minds he'd ever worked with." Ruth smiled. "He's looking forward to catching up." Joy grabbed her sister's hands. "Ruth, this is going to be incredible. Or it's going to be a disaster." "No." Joy's grip tightened. "You walk in there as yourself, your full self, and let them deal with their own prejudices. You've got nothing to prove to them. But maybe they need to learn something." At 6:30, Ruth slipped into the emerald gown. It fit like it had been made for her, hugging her curves, flowing to the floor in a cascade of silk. She added simple gold earrings, her mother's, the only jewelry she'd kept, and a small clutch. Joy called a car service, refusing to let Ruth take the subway. Queens to Manhattan in a gown? Absolutely not. As Ruth stepped into the black car, Joy leaned through the window. "Go show them who Ruth Adams really is." The car pulled away, heading toward Manhattan, toward the Meridian Hotel, toward 500 people who thought they knew what poverty looked like. They had no idea what was coming. The Meridian Hotel rose into the Manhattan skyline like a monument to excess, all glass and gold, with a red carpet stretching from the street to the entrance where photographers clustered like hungry birds. Ruth's car pulled up to the curb at exactly 7 o'clock, and for a moment, she simply sat there, watching the parade of wealth and power ascending the steps. Women in gowns worth more than cars. Men in custom tuxedos. Laughter that sounded like champagne bubbles. This was a different world, and she'd been invited as the evening's entertainment, the poor maid who dared to show her face. "Miss?" The driver glanced back at her. "Are you ready?" Ruth took a deep breath. "Yes. Thank you." The moment her heels touched the pavement, something shifted. Maybe it was the gown, the way the emerald silk caught the lights. Maybe it was the way she held her head, not high with arrogance, but level with quiet dignity. Maybe it was simply that Ruth had decided to stop apologizing for existing. Whatever it was, people noticed. A photographer turned, camera half raised, then lowered it with a confused expression. She didn't look like the typical society fixture, but she didn't look out of place either. She looked regal. Ruth climbed the steps alone, aware of eyes tracking her movement. At the entrance, a young man with a tablet checked names. Ruth Adams, she said clearly. He scrolled, frowned, scrolled again. I don't see you on the main list, but, oh, here you are. Guest of David Cole. Something in his tone suggested he understood what that meant. The pity in his eyes was almost worse than Sandra's cruelty. Enjoy your evening, he said softly, as if she were walking toward execution. Ruth stepped into the grand ballroom and stopped breathing. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from a ceiling painted with celestial murals. Round tables draped in cream silk surrounded a dance floor that gleamed like ice. A string quartet played in one corner while waiters glided between clusters of guests carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than Ruth made in an hour. And everywhere, were the powerful. She recognized faces from television, from magazine covers, from news articles. Senators. Tech moguls. Entertainment executives. Old money and new money, and the kind of money that transcended both. This was Sandra's world. And Ruth was supposed to shatter against it. Oh my God, she actually came. Ruth turned to find Sandra approaching with 3 women in tow, all variations on the same theme, blonde, polished, draped in designer labels like armor. Sandra wore the gold gown, and her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Ladies, this is Ruth. My boyfriend's maid. Sandra's voice carried, intentionally loud. Several nearby conversations paused. Ruth, these are my friends from the Junior League. We were just talking about you. How brave of you to come, one of the women said, her eyes traveling up and down Ruth's dress with naked assessment. That's a lovely gown. Is it vintage? The question was designed to wound, vintage being code for old being code for poor. It's from a UNESCO gala in Paris, Ruth said quietly. 2019. The women exchanged glances, confused by the response that didn't fit their script. UNESCO? Sandra laughed. Ruth, you don't have to impress us with made-up stories. It's okay to shop at thrift stores. We understand your situation. I wasn't shopping, Ruth said, her voice steady. I was speaking on literacy initiatives in developing nations. The silence that followed was interrupted by David's arrival. He looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, like a man who'd realized too late that he'd made a terrible mistake but lacked the courage to correct it. Ruth. You look nice. He glanced at Sandra, seeking guidance. Very nice. Doesn't she? Sandra linked her arm through David's possessively. I told her to come as herself, and she really committed to the fantasy. It's adorable. More guests were arriving, filling the ballroom with noise and movement. Ruth recognized several partners from David's law firm, distinguished men and women who'd passed her in the penthouse hallway a dozen times without seeing her. They saw her now, though. She could feel their stares, hear the whispers starting to circulate. That's David's maid. What is she doing here? This is going to be a disaster. Sandra was already steering her friends toward another group, leaving Ruth standing alone near the entrance like a museum exhibit. This was the plan, Ruth realized. Invite her, isolate her, let her humiliation be the evening's sideshow. She should have felt small. Diminished. Out of place. Instead, Ruth felt something else entirely, free. Free from pretending. Free from invisibility. Free from the cage of other people's expectations. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and took a small sip, her eyes scanning the room. She was looking for one person in particular, a tall man with dark skin and an even darker suit, probably surrounded by admirers and business associates. And then she saw him. Pierre Okafor stood near the far corner, elegant in a navy tuxedo, his bald head gleaming under the chandeliers. He was exactly as she remembered, commanding presence, warm smile, eyes that actually saw people instead of looking through them. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Recognition flashed across his face like sunrise. Ruth smiled. And Pierre Okafor began walking toward her, cutting through the crowd like a ship through water, his expression transforming from pleasant to genuinely delighted. Sandra, who'd been holding court 20 feet away, noticed the movement. She turned, following Pierre's trajectory, and her face went pale when she realized where he was heading. "Ruth Adams," Pierre said, his Nigerian accent rich and warm as he reached her. "Is it really you?" The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. "Mr. Okafor." Ruth's smile widened as she extended her hand. "It's wonderful to see you again." Pierre ignored her hand and pulled her into a warm embrace, the kind reserved for old friends, for equals, for people who mattered. When he stepped back, his hands remained on her shoulders, his eyes bright with genuine pleasure. "Wonderful. Ruth, I have been searching for you for 2 years. You disappeared. Emails bounced back. Phone disconnected. I thought perhaps you'd moved to another country, another continent." He shook his head in amazement. "And here you are, in New York, looking absolutely magnificent." The conversations around them had stopped completely. Every eye in their immediate vicinity was fixed on the spectacle of one of the world's most prominent philanthropists, a man worth an estimated $4 billion, embracing a maid like she was royalty. Sandra stood frozen, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickers of panic. David had gone pale, his lawyer's mind clearly trying to recalculate an equation that no longer made sense. "I've been here," Ruth said carefully. "Life took an unexpected turn. Family circumstances required some adjustments." Pierre's expression softened with understanding. "Your mother. I remember you mentioning her illness." "I'm so sorry, Ruth." He squeezed her hand. "But tell me, are you working with another organization now? Last I heard, you were revolutionizing adult literacy programs. You had that brilliant model using mobile technology and peer education. Genius, truly genius." "Actually, Pierre." A silver-haired woman in diamonds approached, followed by 2 men in expensive suits. "There you are. The governor wants to meet you before dinner." "In a moment, Catherine." Pierre kept his attention on Ruth. "I'm catching up with an old colleague. One of the brightest minds I've ever had the privilege to work with." The woman named Catherine looked at Ruth with new interest, clearly reassessing. "Oh. What field?" "International development and education," Pierre said proudly, as if Ruth were his protégé. Ruth coordinated the Pan-African Literacy Initiative, 50,000 children across 7 countries. She wrote the implementation framework that 3 governments adopted. She speaks English, French, Swahili, and Portuguese. And she did all this before turning 23. He turned back to Ruth. "How old are you now?" 25. 26. 25, Ruth confirmed softly. "Incredible." Pierre shook his head. "Catherine, this young woman could teach most of our nonprofit sector how to actually create sustainable change. She doesn't just throw money at problems, she builds systems that empower people." Catherine's demeanor had completely transformed. "Would you be interested in speaking at our foundation's annual summit? We're always looking for fresh perspectives on education reform." Before Ruth could respond, Sandra materialized at her elbow, her smile brittle, her voice artificially bright. "Pierre. I see you've met Ruth. She works for my boyfriend, David, he's one of the partners at Cole and Harrison. Ruth is his." She paused, her eyes glittering with malice. "Well, she helps around his home. The implication hung in the air like poison, she's the help. Nothing more. Pierre's eyebrows rose. He looked at Ruth, then at Sandra, then back at Ruth. Understanding dawned slowly across his face, not just of Ruth's current circumstances, but of the cruelty that had orchestrated this entire evening. She helps around his home, Pierre repeated slowly. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine incredulity. Sandra, is it? Let me tell you something about Ruth Adams. When I was trying to establish community learning centers in Lagos, Ruth was the one who negotiated with local chiefs and government officials. She was 22 years old, and she had tribal leaders and ministers eating out of her hand within hours. She secured land rights, built partnerships, and created a model that's still functioning today. His voice grew firm. Ruth Adams doesn't just help around homes. Ruth Adams builds communities. She transforms lives. She is the kind of person who makes the world demonstrably better by existing in it. The silence that followed was absolute. Sandra's face had gone from pale to crimson. I didn't know she. David never mentioned. Clearly, David doesn't know who he employs, Pierre said coolly. He turned to Ruth, his voice gentle again. Ruth, I'm hosting a dinner next week, small gathering, 20 people, mostly foundation directors and social entrepreneurs. Would you join us? I'd love to hear what you've been working on and discuss some opportunities. Ruth felt the weight of every stare in the ballroom. She could see David standing 10 feet away, his mouth slightly open, his expression somewhere between shock and dawning horror. She could see Sandra's friends whispering frantically to each other. She could see partners from Cole and Harrison clustered together, their faces marked with confusion and curiosity. This was the moment. The pivot point. Everything that came after would be determined by what she said next. Ruth met Pierre's kind eyes and smiled. I would be honored, Mr. Okafor. Please, call me Pierre. We're colleagues, after all. Always have been, always will be. He raised his champagne glass. To Ruth Adams, proof that brilliance doesn't announce itself with titles and wealth. Sometimes it moves quietly, doing the work that actually matters. Around them, hesitantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, glasses rose in response. And Sandra Mitchell realized, far too late, that her joke had just exploded in her face. The dinner bell chimed, a delicate sound that somehow cut through the buzzing conversations filling the grand ballroom. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables, consulting small cards tucked into their clutches and jacket pockets. Ruth stood still, suddenly aware that she had no idea where she was supposed to sit, if she'd even been assigned a seat at all. Sandra had probably planned for her to stand awkwardly by the entrance all night, watching from the margins. Ruth, you're at my table, Pierre said, as if reading her mind. He offered his arm. I specifically requested they add a seat. I hope you don't mind sitting with boring foundation executives and a Supreme Court justice. Ruth took his arm, feeling the stares intensify as they crossed the ballroom together. She could hear the whispers now, no longer mocking but confused, curious, recalculating. Who is she? Did you hear what Pierre said? David's maid worked in international development. Why is she cleaning houses? They reached a table near the front, marked with a small gold number 3. Already seated were 5 people who radiated power in that understated way truly important people did. No need for loud voices or flashy jewelry when your decisions shaped policy and moved millions of dollars. Pierre made introductions. Everyone, this is Ruth Adams, the literacy coordinator I mentioned during our last quarterly meeting. Ruth, this is Justice Marion Webb, Franklin Chen from the Chen Foundation, Dr. Amara Okonkwo from Howard University, Robert Ashford from the Department of Education, and Isabella Torres, who runs the largest immigrant advocacy network in the Northeast. Each person greeted Ruth with genuine interest, their handshakes firm, their questions thoughtful. This was what professional respect felt like, Ruth remembered, being treated as a peer, as someone whose ideas mattered, as a human being with value beyond their service. She'd forgotten how much she missed it. 2 tables away, Sandra sat with David and his law firm colleagues, her face frozen in a smile that looked more like a grimace. David kept glancing toward Ruth's table, his expression unreadable. The senior partner, Gerald Harrison, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for ruthlessness, was watching Ruth with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "So, Ruth," Justice Webb said as the first course arrived, a delicate salad with edible flowers. "Pierre tells us you've been doing fascinating work in literacy education. What brought you to that field?" Ruth set down her fork carefully. This was the moment she could retreat into vague pleasantries, or she could be honest. She chose honesty. "My mother never learned to read properly," Ruth said quietly. "She was brilliant, could do complex math in her head, memorized everything she heard, built a life through sheer determination. But she was ashamed of her illiteracy. It limited her opportunities, her confidence, her sense of what she deserved." Ruth paused, feeling the familiar ache of loss. "When I was 15, I started volunteering at an adult learning center. I watched people my mother's age discover that they weren't stupid or broken, they just never had the right chance. That transformation, it became my calling." Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with interest. "The Pan-African Initiative, that was your framework, correct? The one using SMS technology and community learning circles?" "Yes. We recognized that smartphones were becoming ubiquitous even in rural areas, but literacy programs were still based on Western classroom models that didn't fit people's lives. So we created short, daily lessons delivered via text message, paired with weekly community circles where people practiced together. The peer support was crucial, learning became communal rather than isolating." "And the results?" Franklin Chen asked. 73% completion rate over 6 months, compared to the typical 20% for traditional programs. Participants reported increased income, on average 35%, within a year of completion. But the most important metric was confidence. People stopped believing they were incapable. They started seeing themselves as learners, as capable of growth. The conversation flowed from there, a genuine exchange of ideas, challenges, innovations. Ruth felt parts of herself awakening that had been dormant for 3 years. This was who she was, someone who thought deeply about problems, who created solutions, who believed change was possible. Across the room, she caught David watching her. Their eyes met, and she saw something new in his expression, recognition, maybe. Or shame. The main course arrived, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and the conversation shifted to current challenges in social services. Isabella Torres was describing funding cuts to immigrant literacy programs when a young woman approached the table with a microphone. "Mr. Okafor. They're ready for you to give the keynote address." Pierre nodded, then turned to Ruth with a mischievous smile. "Actually, would you mind if I made an audacious request?" Ruth felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of request?" "Join me on stage. I was planning to talk about innovation in nonprofit work. But you're the living embodiment of what I wanted to say. Would you share your story? Just 5 minutes. Tell these people what real development work looks like." Ruth's first instinct was to refuse. This wasn't her night. She was here as a guest, not a speaker. She'd come to simply show up, to exist as herself. But then she looked around the ballroom, at the wealth, the power, the people who made decisions that affected millions but rarely met the people their policies touched. She thought about Sandra's cruel laughter, about David's casual blindness, about every time someone had looked through her like she was invisible. What if people could see poverty differently? Ruth heard herself asking. Not as a moral failing, but as a circumstance that doesn't erase someone's worth or capability. This question wasn't just for the conversation at her table, it was for everyone who'd ever judged someone by their bank account instead of their humanity. What would you want the wealthy and powerful to understand about dignity and worth? Pierre's smile widened. Then let's show them. Ruth set down her napkin and stood, her heart pounding. It was time to stop being invisible. The stage was elevated, bathed in soft golden light that made the microphone stand gleam like a beacon. As Ruth walked toward it beside Pierre, she became aware of the silence spreading through the ballroom, conversations dying mid-sentence, champagne glasses pausing mid-sip, 500 faces turning toward the front. Sandra's face had gone completely white. Pierre took the microphone first, his voice warm and commanding. "Good evening, everyone. I know you were expecting me to give my usual speech about the importance of sustainable philanthropy, and don't worry, I've prepared 45 slides." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But tonight, I want to do something different. I want to introduce you to someone who embodies everything we claim to value in the nonprofit sector but rarely achieve: genuine impact, humility, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity." He gestured to Ruth. "Many of you have heard me speak about the Pan-African Literacy Initiative, a program that reached 50,000 people and achieved completion rates that shattered industry standards. What you didn't know was that the architect of that program, the coordinator who made it work, is standing right here. Ruth Adams." The applause was polite but confused. People were still trying to reconcile the woman in the emerald gown with whatever story they thought they knew. Pierre handed Ruth the microphone and stepped back, his expression encouraging. Ruth stood alone at the center of the stage, holding the microphone in hands that had scrubbed toilets that morning. She looked out at the sea of faces, powerful, privileged, waiting to judge. And she began to speak. 3 years ago, I stood on a stage like this in Geneva, accepting an award for innovation in development work. I was 22 years old, and I genuinely believed that if you worked hard enough, cared deeply enough, and built the right systems, you could change the world. Ruth's voice was steady, conversational. Then my mother got cancer. Stage 4. Terminal. The ballroom was absolutely silent now. The medical bills destroyed us. Everything we'd saved, everything we'd built, gone in 18 months. My mother fought as hard as she could, but cancer doesn't care about hard work or good character. She died, and I was left with debt and a sister still in college. Ruth paused. So I did what millions of people do every day. I took whatever work I could find. I cleaned houses. I scrubbed floors. I became invisible. She could see David now, his face stricken, as if he were seeing her for the first time. For 3 years, I've worked in homes like many of yours. I've dusted your bookshelves, organized your closets, prepared your meals. And I've been invisible to you, not because I was hiding, but because you couldn't see me. You saw a maid. You saw poverty. You saw someone whose worth was measured by their hourly wage. Ruth's voice remained gentle, but her words cut clean. You never saw a person who'd negotiated with government ministers, who spoke 4 languages, who'd built educational systems from nothing. She could feel the discomfort spreading through the room, people shifting in their seats, some looking down at their plates. I don't say this to make you feel guilty. I say it because this invisibility, this assumption that poor people are somehow less intelligent, less capable, less worthy, it's the greatest barrier to real change. You can fund programs and build schools and write checks, but if you fundamentally don't see poor people as your equals, as fully human, then you're just managing poverty, not ending it. Justice Webb was nodding slowly. Dr. Okonkwo had tears in her eyes. Tonight, I was invited to this event as a joke. Ruth said it plainly, without drama. Someone thought it would be funny to watch the poor maid stumble through a world where she didn't belong. But here's what they didn't understand: I've always belonged in rooms like this. Not because of my clothes or my bank account, but because I have something to contribute. I have ideas, experience, insight. I have dignity. Her eyes found Sandra, who looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. I clean houses now, but I have never stopped building people. Every conversation I have with the women I meet at the laundromat, every time I help someone's child with homework, every moment I choose to see others clearly, that's still development work. That's still changing the world. The venue has changed, but my purpose hasn't. Ruth's voice strengthened. So here's my challenge to everyone in this room: look at the people who serve you. Really look at them. The person who parks your car, who serves your coffee, who cleans your office, they have stories, dreams, capabilities you've never bothered to discover. They're not background characters in your life story. They're the protagonists of their own. She paused, letting the words settle. True change doesn't start with programs or funding. It starts with seeing. Really seeing. Recognizing that a person's current circumstances don't define their worth or limit their potential. It starts with understanding that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you possess simply by being human. Ruth set the microphone back on its stand. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Pierre, for seeing me when others couldn't. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the applause began, not polite charity applause, but something genuine and thunderous. People rose to their feet, one table at a time, until the entire ballroom was standing. All except Sandra, who sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. And David, whose hands were pressed against his eyes as if he couldn't bear to look at himself. Ruth descended from the stage into a wave of people. They surged forward, foundation directors pressing business cards into her hands, non-profit leaders asking for her contact information, journalists requesting interviews. It was overwhelming, disorienting, like being pulled into a current she couldn't control. Pierre materialized at her side, gently steering her through the crowd. Breathe, he murmured. You just changed the conversation in this entire room. A woman from PBS wanted her for a segment on hidden poverty. A university dean offered a guest lecture position. The head of a major think tank mentioned a research fellowship. The offers came so fast Ruth couldn't process them, each one representing opportunities she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. Ms. Adams. A young reporter with a phone camera pushed forward. Your speech is already going viral on social media. Someone live-streamed it. You have over 2 million views in the last 10 minutes. Ruth's stomach dropped. What? The reporter turned her phone screen around. There was Ruth on stage, her words captioned and shared across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. The comments were scrolling faster than she could read them. This is what dignity looks like. I'm crying. She's so right. Every wealthy person needs to hear this. Who is she? We need more people like her in leadership. But there were other comments too. Cole and Harrison hired her as a maid. David Cole is a fraud. Talks about justice but can't see the brilliant woman in his own home. Sandra Mitchell is trash for setting this up. The story was taking on a life of its own, morphing beyond Ruth's control. She'd wanted to make a point, to reclaim her dignity, not to become a viral sensation, not to destroy people's reputations. Ruth. David's voice cut through the noise. He stood a few feet away, having pushed through the crowd, his face pale and drawn. Can we talk? Please. Pierre stepped protectively closer to Ruth. I don't think. It's okay, Ruth said quietly. She turned to David. 5 minutes. They moved to a quiet corner near the coat check, away from the chaos. David looked like a man who'd been in an accident, shocked, disoriented, struggling to understand what had just happened. I didn't know, he said, his voice rough. Ruth, I swear to God, I didn't know who you were. What you'd done. I never asked. I never, he stopped, his hands shaking. That's not an excuse. That's the problem. I never asked because I never thought to ask. You were just, there. Part of the furniture. Ruth said nothing, waiting. Sandra invited you as a joke. I knew that. I knew it, and I let it happen because. He swallowed hard. Because it was easier than confronting her. Easier than admitting I'd been complicit in treating you like you were invisible. I convinced myself it was harmless, that you wouldn't be hurt, that it didn't matter. It mattered, Ruth said softly. I know. God, Ruth, I know that now. David dragged his hand through his hair. I've built my entire career on defending people's dignity. I've given speeches about equality and justice. And the whole time, I had someone extraordinary working in my home, and I treated her like she was nothing. Behind them, Ruth could hear raised voices. She turned to see Sandra arguing with Gerald Harrison and two other senior partners from the firm. Sandra's face was blotchy with tears, her carefully constructed composure shattered. Complete PR nightmare. Harrison was saying. Do you understand what you've done? We have clients calling. The press is already asking questions. Cole and Harrison, where social justice meets hypocrisy. That's the headline circulating right now. I didn't mean, Sandra started. You invited an employee to a public event specifically to humiliate her. Harrison's voice was ice. And it turns out that employee is more accomplished than half the people in this room. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? One of the other partners noticed Ruth watching. His expression shifted from anger to something like fear. They weren't concerned about what they'd done to Ruth, they were concerned about their reputation, their image, their bottom line. Ms. Adams. Harrison approached, his smile practiced and empty. I want to apologize on behalf of Cole and Harrison. We had no idea about your background. If we'd known you had such impressive credentials, we certainly would have treated me differently. Ruth finished quietly. That's the problem, Mr. Harrison. My worth shouldn't depend on my resume. The woman you didn't know about, the one who cleaned your offices, she deserved respect too. Not because of what she'd accomplished, but because she was a person doing honest work. Harrison's smile faltered. We'd like to offer you a position, he said, pivoting quickly. A real position. Community Outreach Coordinator. Salary, benefits, your own office. We can announce it tomorrow, show that we value. No, Ruth said. Harrison blinked. Excuse me. No. Thank you, but no. Ruth's voice was calm, certain. You're offering me a job to save your reputation, not because you value me. That's not respect. That's damage control. She turned away from Harrison, from David, from Sandra who was now openly weeping near the ballroom entrance. Pierre was waiting, his expression proud. Ready to leave? More than ready. The car Pierre arranged was nothing like the modest sedan Ruth had arrived in. This was a town car with leather seats and a privacy screen, insulated from the chaos they'd left behind at the Meridian. Ruth sank into the seat, suddenly exhausted, as Manhattan's light streaked past the windows. Where are we going? She asked. Wherever you want, Pierre said. But I was hoping you'd let me buy you a proper cup of coffee. There's an all-night cafe in Brooklyn, quiet, no press, no society people. Just conversation. Ruth gave him her neighborhood, and 30 minutes later they sat in a corner booth of Mama Lou's, a small diner that served the best pie in Brooklyn and didn't care who you were or what you wore. The elderly woman behind the counter took one look at Ruth in her emerald gown and Pierre in his tuxedo and simply said, "Coffee's fresh. Pie's fresh. Sit wherever." Pierre ordered 2 coffees and 2 slices of sweet potato pie. When the waitress left, he leaned back and studied Ruth with concern. How are you? Really? Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat ground her. I don't know. 2 hours ago, I was invisible. Now I'm viral. I'm not sure which is more terrifying. The visibility, probably, Pierre said gently. Invisibility is safe. Being seen means being vulnerable. My phone won't stop buzzing. Ruth had turned it face down on the table, but she could feel it vibrating with notifications. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize, emails flooding her inbox, social media requests piling up faster than she could count. There are reporters outside my apartment building. Joy texted me that CNN called our landline. Our landline, Pierre. I didn't even know we still had a landline. Pierre smiled slightly. Welcome to the very strange world of viral fame. It'll calm down in a few days, but right now, you're the story everyone wants to tell. He paused. The question is, what story do you want to tell? Ruth took a sip of coffee, considering. I didn't do this for fame. I just wanted to exist as myself for one night. To stop apologizing for being poor. To remind myself, and maybe them, that circumstances don't define worth. You did more than that. You held up a mirror to an entire class of people and forced them to see their own prejudice. That's powerful. That's also dangerous. Pierre's expression grew serious. There will be backlash, Ruth. People defending Sandra, saying you're playing the victim card, arguing that you should be grateful for any job. The internet is already dividing into camps. You need to be prepared. I know. Ruth had seen some of the comments already, the cruel ones mixed in with the supportive ones. She's just bitter because she failed. If she was so brilliant, why is she cleaning houses? This is a publicity stunt. But you'll also have opportunities, Pierre continued. Real ones. I've already had 3 foundation directors reach out to me asking if you'd consider consulting work. The speaking fees alone could change your financial situation significantly. You could return to the work you love. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her coffee. What if I don't want to return to exactly what I was doing before? What do you mean? I loved international development. I loved the programs, the impact, the scale. But these past 3 years, cleaning houses, riding the subway, living in a neighborhood where people struggle, it's changed what I see. The problems aren't just overseas, Pierre. They're here. They're my neighbors who work 3 jobs and still can't afford healthcare. They're the women at the laundromat who are brilliant but have no pathway forward. They're everywhere, invisible, just like I was. Pierre's eyes lit up with understanding. So what would you build? Ruth felt something crystallizing in her mind, an idea that had been forming during her speech, solidifying as she spoke. A community center. Not just for literacy, though that would be part of it. But also legal aid, job training, childcare, mental health services. A place where working-class people, especially women, could access the resources they need to change their circumstances. Not charity. Empowerment. The Ruth Adams Community Hub, Pierre said immediately. That's too. It's perfect. And I want to fund it. Pierre pulled out his phone. I've been looking for a project like this. Something local, sustainable, led by someone who understands both the systems and the streets. Give me a budget. Give me a plan. Let's build it. Ruth felt tears pricking her eyes. Pierre, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Ruth, you're sitting on a moment right now. The whole country is paying attention to your story. Use it. Build something that outlasts the viral fame. Create the change you talked about on that stage. The bell above the diner door chimed. Ruth looked up to see Joy bursting in, still in her pajama pants and a hastily thrown-on jacket, her natural hair wild around her face. Ruthie. Joy rushed to the booth and threw her arms around her sister. Oh my God, I saw the video. Everyone saw the video. You were incredible. You were, she pulled back, noticing Pierre for the first time. Oh. Hi. I'm Joy. Ruth's sister. Sorry for the pajamas. Pierre Okafor. He stood and shook her hand warmly. The sister who's in college. Ruth speaks very highly of you. She does. Joy looked at Ruth with surprise. Of course I do, Ruth said softly. You're the reason I kept going these past 3 years. You and your dreams. Joy's eyes filled with tears. She slid into the booth next to Ruth, grabbing her sister's hands. What happens now? Everything's crazy. There are news vans outside our building. Mrs. Chen from upstairs thinks you're a celebrity. Mr. Rodriguez offered to be your bodyguard. Ruth laughed despite herself. I don't need a bodyguard. You might, Pierre said seriously. At least for a few weeks. The attention will be intense. You'll need help managing it, a publicist, maybe a lawyer to review any contracts or offers. This is going to move fast, Ruth. You need support. I'll help. Joy said immediately. I can screen calls, manage emails, keep the reporters away. Consider me your assistant. You have classes. Ruth, you just became a national news story. I think I can miss a few sociology lectures. Joy squeezed her hands. Let me help you. Please. Ruth looked at her sister, earnest, loyal, fierce, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly knocked her over. Then she looked at Pierre, who'd crossed an ocean of wealth and privilege to see her as an equal. Finally, she thought about the women in her neighborhood, the invisible ones like she'd been, waiting for someone to see them too. Okay, Ruth said quietly. Let's do this. Let's build something real. Pierre raised his coffee mug. To the Ruth Adams Community Hub. To seeing people. To changing the world one neighborhood at a time. They clinked mugs, coffee instead of champagne, a Brooklyn diner instead of a crystal ballroom, and Ruth felt something shift inside her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. And she was going to make sure no one else had to be either. 6 months later, Ruth stood in front of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, watching workers install the final letters of the sign above the entrance, the Ruth Adams Community Hub. The spring morning was warm, the kind of day that felt like possibility. Behind her, Joy was coordinating with the catering company, local businesses Ruth had specifically chosen, owned by people from the neighborhood. Inside, volunteers were setting up chairs for the opening ceremony scheduled to begin in 2 hours. Pierre's initial investment had been generous, but it was the groundswell of public support that had truly made this possible. Ruth's speech had sparked something: donations from thousands of ordinary people, partnership offers from universities and nonprofits, pro bono legal work from lawyers who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Even corporations had reached out, though Ruth had been selective, refusing any partnership that felt like reputation washing. Ms. Adams. A young reporter from the local news approached with a cameraman. Can we get a few words before the ceremony? Ruth had learned to navigate media attention over the past months, not to fear it, but to use it strategically. Every interview was a chance to talk about the real issues: poverty, dignity, systemic barriers, the brilliance that existed in every community if people bothered to look. Of course. The reporter, a black woman in her 30s named Keisha, smiled warmly. So today's the big day. How does it feel to see this vision become reality? Surreal, Ruth admitted. 6 months ago, I was cleaning houses and trying to stay invisible. Now we're opening a center that will serve thousands of people every year. But the most important thing isn't the building, it's what the building represents. This is proof that every community has the resources it needs to thrive. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it. You've turned down several high-paying positions to focus on this project. Why? Ruth had indeed received numerous offers: consulting gigs, speaking tours, executive positions at major nonprofits. She declined most of them, accepting only occasional speaking engagements that aligned with her mission and paid fees she immediately redirected to the hub. Because this work isn't about personal success. It's about collective transformation. The women who'll walk through these doors, they're not looking for saviors. They're looking for opportunities, for resources, for someone to see their potential. That's what we're offering. The interview wrapped up, and Ruth walked inside to check on the preparations. The space was stunning. Pierre had connected her with architects who'd created an environment that felt both professional and welcoming. There were classrooms for literacy and job training, a legal aid clinic staffed by volunteer attorneys, childcare facilities with certified caregivers, a computer lab with high-speed internet, and a community gathering space with comfortable seating and natural light. But Ruth's favorite part was the wall of stories, a corridor where community members could share their journeys. Already, before the official opening, dozens of people had contributed photos and written testimonials. Ruth stopped in front of one that made her chest tight. "My name is Gloria. I cleaned offices for 20 years. Everyone walked past me like I was a ghost." Then I heard Ruth Adams speak, and I remembered I used to be a teacher in Columbia. This place helped me get my certification recognized. Next month, I start teaching again. I'm not invisible anymore. It's beautiful, isn't it? Ruth turned to find David Cole standing behind her, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. She hadn't seen him since that night at the Meridian, though he tried to reach out multiple times. She'd needed space, time to process everything that had happened. "David. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't sure I should." He gestured toward the wall. "But I wanted to see what you'd built. And I wanted to apologize properly. Not in the middle of chaos, but here, in this place that proves everything I failed to see." Ruth studied him. He looked different, less polished, more genuine. The practiced lawyer's smile was gone, replaced by something raw. "I ended things with Sandra," David continued. "That night, actually. After you left, she kept trying to blame you, saying you'd manipulated the situation. And I realized I'd been with someone whose values were completely opposed to everything I claimed to believe in." He paused. "But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was me. I've spent 6 months in therapy, Ruth, trying to understand how I became someone who could look at another human being every day and never see them. And what did you learn? That privilege makes you lazy. It lets you avoid uncomfortable truths. It's easier to see people as functions, maid, driver, server, than as whole human beings with complex lives. Because if I'd seen you as a person, I'd have had to confront how I was treating you. I'd have had to change." Ruth nodded slowly. "So what are you doing here, David?" "2 things." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "First, this is a check from Cole and Harrison. $250,000 for the hub. It's not charity, it's accountability. We've also established a scholarship fund for community college students and committed to hiring from underserved neighborhoods." Gerald Harrison fought it, but the younger partners pushed back. "Your speech changed the culture of the entire firm." Ruth took the envelope, surprised by the weight of it. "Second," David continued, "I wanted to ask if you'd let me volunteer here. Not in any leadership capacity, just whatever you need. Filing papers, answering phones, cleaning." He smiled slightly at the irony. "I need to learn to see people again. And I think this place could teach me." Before Ruth could respond, Joy's voice echoed through the building. "Ruthie. People are starting to arrive." Through the large windows, Ruth could see the crowd gathering outside, neighbors, supporters, former colleagues, people whose lives had been touched by her story. She spotted Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez from her apartment building. She saw women from the laundromat, holding hand-painted signs. She saw Pierre arriving in a town car with Justice Webb and Dr. Okonkwo. And standing near the back, hesitant but present, was Sandra Mitchell. Ruth caught her breath. Sandra looked diminished somehow, not physically, but in spirit. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the weight of consequence she'd been carrying. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sandra's face crumpled with emotion. She asked if she could come, David said quietly. She's been trying to make amends. Volunteering, donating, going to therapy. I'm not saying she's changed completely, but she's trying. That's something. Ruth thought about forgiveness, about how dignity meant recognizing humanity in everyone, even those who'd failed to recognize yours. She wasn't ready to forget. But maybe, eventually, there could be grace. Tell her she's welcome to stay for the ceremony, Ruth said finally. The next hour was a blur of handshakes and hugs, of reporters and speeches, of Joy introducing Ruth to what felt like half of Brooklyn. When it was time for Ruth to speak, she stood on a small platform outside the hub, microphone in hand, looking at the hundreds of faces, brown and white, old and young, wealthy and struggling, all gathered to witness this moment. 6 months ago, I stood on a stage and talked about invisibility, Ruth began. About how we fail to see people when they don't fit our expectations of what matters, what's valuable, what's important. Today, I'm standing in front of a building that exists because thousands of people decided to see differently. She gestured to the hub behind her. This isn't just a community center. It's a statement that every person has inherent worth, that circumstances don't define capability, that investment in people always yields returns. The women who'll come through these doors aren't charity cases. They're teachers and entrepreneurs and leaders waiting for the resources to rise. Our job is simply to provide those resources and get out of their way. Ruth's voice strengthened. I won't pretend the past 6 months have been easy. Viral fame is strange and uncomfortable. There's been backlash, criticism, people who say I'm bitter or playing victim or opportunistic. That's fine. I'm not doing this for approval. I'm doing this because I remember what invisibility feels like, and I refuse to let another person disappear simply because society failed to see them. She looked directly at the cameras. To everyone watching who feels invisible, in your workplace, in your community, in your own family, I see you. Your worth isn't determined by your salary or your title or your zip code. You matter. Your dreams matter. Your dignity matters. And there are people fighting to build a world that recognizes that. The applause was thunderous. Pierre cut the ribbon officially opening the hub, and the crowd surged forward to tour the facility. Ruth found herself swept along, accepting congratulations, answering questions, watching people explore the spaces with wonder and hope. In the legal aid clinic, she saw an elderly woman crying as a volunteer lawyer explained how they could help save her home from foreclosure. In the computer lab, teenagers were already logging on, researching colleges they'd never thought they could attend. In the childcare room, mothers were dropping off their children, trusting strangers for the first time because the hub felt safe, felt like it was truly for them. This was what change looked like. Not grand gestures or viral moments, but steady, patient, consistent work of seeing people and creating pathways forward. As the sun set and the crowds thinned, Ruth found herself alone in the community gathering space. She walked to the window and looked out at Brooklyn, her neighborhood, her home, her community. Somewhere in those buildings were women like she'd been, brilliant and struggling, invisible but not broken. Tomorrow, they would start coming through the doors. And Ruth would be there to see them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Joy, "Mom would be so proud of you." Ruth smiled, tears blurring her vision. Her mother had spent her life ashamed of what she couldn't do. Ruth had spent the past 6 months proving that worth wasn't about what you lacked, it was about who you were and what you believed was possible. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered to the evening air. "For teaching me to see people. For showing me that dignity isn't earned, it's inherent. For raising me to know my worth even when the world tried to tell me otherwise." The Ruth Adams Community Hub would serve thousands. It would change lives, create opportunities, and prove that investment in people always mattered more than investment in institutions. But more than that, it would stand as a reminder that every person cleaning an office, serving coffee, parking cars, or scrubbing floors had a story worth hearing, a dream worth supporting, and a dignity worth protecting. Ruth had been invisible once. Never again. Not her, and not anyone who walked through her doors. She turned off the lights and locked up, her emerald dress from that night at the Meridian now hanging in a display case in the entrance with a plaque that read, "This gown represents a moment when one woman refused to stay invisible." May everyone who enters here know they are seen, valued, and worthy. Ruth walked out into the Brooklyn night, no longer a maid, no longer invisible, but simply and powerfully herself, a woman who'd remembered her worth and built a legacy to help others remember theirs. The story that was supposed to end in her humiliation had become a story of redemption, dignity, and triumph. And it was only the beginning. 1 year later. The Ruth Adams Community Hub served over 3,000 people in its first year. 85 women completed job training programs. 47 obtained legal assistance that changed their circumstances. 212 children received quality childcare while their parents pursued education or employment. Ruth became a sought-after speaker and consultant, using her platform to advocate for systemic change in how society viewed and supported working-class communities. David Cole left his firm to start a non-profit legal practice serving low-income clients, finally aligning his work with his stated values. Sandra Mitchell quietly funded scholarships for domestic workers to pursue higher education, never seeking publicity but consistently showing up. Joy graduated with honors and joined the Hub as its operations director. Pierre Okafor expanded the model to 5 more cities, each one led by someone from the community it served. And Ruth? Ruth continued doing what she'd always done, seeing people, building systems, and proving that dignity was never a privilege, it was a right. She was no longer invisible. And neither were the thousands who followed her through those doors, each one carrying their own brilliance, their own worth, their own undeniable humanity.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for tuning in and watching this video. You being here is the best encouragement I could ask for. The simplest and best way to show your support and tell me you want to see more content is to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That's your way of sending me love. I don't want the adventure to stop yet though. To enjoy more thrilling videos, go ahead and click the next video thumbnail you see right now. Enjoy and thanks again.